February failed. It failed to reach agreement on the multiannual financial framework for the next 7 years. It failed to take robust action to resolve the humanitarian rights abuses and the growing crisis occurring in Syria. And according to official documents, it failed to even discuss COVID-19, which had already been declared a public health emergency of international concern 3 weeks before, on the 30th of January last. There is, as others have said, Ceann Comhairle, a crisis of leadership in the democratic world, and the European Union needs to present solutions to the rise of xenophobia, protectionism and backward-looking nationalism that is all too visible in Britain, the United States and on Europe's eastern borders. It also needs to provide leadership on the challenges of climate change, on migration and on new infectious diseases. Speaking to the European Parliament, Michel Barnier describes a conversation that he'd had with one of the architects of Brexit, Nigel Farage. Barnier asked Farage about his vision of UK relations with the European Union post-Brexit. Farage's simple reply was that the EU won't exist after Brexit. This is clearly the attitude of Brexiteers and potentially the attitude of some within the current British government. There is no doubt that the United Kingdom will continue to influence the European Union for the foreseeable future. This is inevitable, given the geographical proximity of Britain and the size of the British economy. There are still many people in the UK who are pro-EU, but the current British government is clearly not. In recent statements, British government spokespeople have retreated from legal commitments made in the withdrawal agreement about a level playing field, and they are coy in relation to Northern Ireland's status. They've also walked back from our clear understanding of the future UK-EU relationship as outlined in the negotiated political declaration. Some senior British spokespeople have called for unlimited trade with the European single market, but without any of the legally binding commitments of equivalent standards. Given the volume of trade involved, British access to the single market on the same basis as Canada would constitute a genuine threat to the cohesion of the European Union from Brexit. In this context, where we need to strengthen the EU, the wrangling over the EU budget for the next 7 years is a failure of leadership and, in my view, a failure of solidarity. The so-called frugal four governments of Austria, Denmark, the Netherlands and Sweden, including, regrettably, 2 governments involving Labour's sister parties in Europe, are making a serious error of judgment in trying to limit the EU's budget to 1% of GDP. It's as clear as day that the EU needs to do more to tackle climate change. It is equally clear that the EU needs to do more to solve the tragedy of the growing refugee crisis on our own doorstep, which has worsened in recent days, as other speakers have pointed out, as Turkey has weakened its cooperation with Europe. And we have to do these things, these major undertakings, without the financial contribution that the UK formally made as a member state. So it's simply nonsensical for member states to insist that the EU do more without being willing to put in place adequate funding to address these major challenges. What we are seeing in several governments is the echoing of Thatcher's narrow-minded transactional perspective of Europe, of what you pay in and what you get out, and seeing the existence of the European Union in those very narrow, balanced book terms, ignoring the enormous benefit of being part of a single market of over 400 million people, where governments routinely cooperate to their mutual advantage. It is time for all EU member states to show solidarity with each other and with the people of Europe. If issues like climate and migration are best dealt with at EU level, and that's what we're saying, then that is the level where we need to put the necessary funds, rather than keep the same money at national or local level for policies that demonstrably will be less effective at that level and less cost efficient in achieving our common objectives. Getting the 7-year budget framework agreed at the next Council meeting, scheduled for the 27th of March, will be a major test of leadership for the European Union. The situation in Syria is another major test. I mentioned earlier that the European Council failed at the last meeting to take robust action. To be more specific, human rights abuses are taking place right now in Syria by the Assad regime. And it's not good enough, as the EU has done, to simply condemn these attacks and call for others to cease fire. The EU should and could have done more to tighten sanctions, not only on the Syrian regime, but on the backers of the Assad tyranny. Europe needs to speak and to act with both clarity and firmness. Finally, the EU's negotiating position for engaging with the UK has been recently published. And likewise, the UK negotiating position has also been set out. To say the least of it, Ceann Comhairle, there are major differences in the starting position of both sides. The UK has rowed back on its commitments to a level playing field, while the EU has rightly doubled down on our collective insistence that we protect workers' rights, consumer rights, and the hard-won environmental standards that we put in place. We are likely to see difficult negotiations in relation to dispute resolutions, in relation to data protection, in relation to fishing rights, and whether or not the EU gives British financial services access to our financial markets. I have confidence that Michel Barnier will robustly defend European interests, and I know that he is well briefed on Ireland's vulnerability to Brexit and on the details of our specific concerns. At the same time, the European Council will be highly influential over the EU's decisions about trade with the United Kingdom. There is no doubt, Ceann Comhairle, that there will be pressure from many sources to simply get a deal done, rather than to allow trade to revert to WTO terms at the end of this year. In the short term, trading on WTO rules would be seriously damaging to Ireland. Nobody is under any illusion about that. However, we can't let the short term dictate our long-term national interest. Ireland's basic freedom to develop our own economy and our society as we choose will be highly constrained if the United Kingdom is permitted to trade with the European single market with lower environmental standards, weaker data protection and fewer workers' rights. This would create an intolerable future for Ireland, where the size of the UK in terms of population and economic clout would pull Ireland down to lower standards in order to compete. Whatever deal is made, there will be no political appetite to reopen the future EU-UK deal in any future short-term perspective. So Ireland will be locked into whatever deal is done in the coming months. That's why we must defend our long-term interests, which are aligned with high-quality standards, robust regulation of the single market, not the deregulation approach that the UK is currently advancing. The UK left the EU at the end of January, but the real challenge of Brexit has yet to come. It is imperative that we have strong government in place here as soon as possible to fight for Ireland's long-term national interest, and they will be difficult battles in the months ahead. So, Ceann Comhairle, whoever is Taoiseach on the 27th of March will travel to the next European Council meeting, which will be a pivotal one. He or she should outline in the coming days here how they foresee those vital interests will be defended. So perhaps the three members of this House who see themselves as potential Taoiseach might rise to that challenge and set out their vision of how those interests would be protected in the coming days.
Thank you.